Chris here from Brickhouse Paddles. Today I want to talk to you about paddle replacement. The ugly truth is, sooner or later you're going to have to replace your paddle. Paddles aren't designed to last forever, and they have to be replaced. It's not like you can restring them. So let's talk a little bit about what necessitates paddle replacement, and not necessarily because you want to replace it, but because it's actually time to replace it, because you can actually blame it for your poor shots. So what affects the life of a paddle? Let's talk about that for a second first. Well, a lot of things, including what your paddle is made of, how it's constructed, what materials are in it, and your style of play. How you play has a huge impact on how long your paddle is going to last. Are you a banger and a smasher? Are you more of a finesse player? Are you playing indoors or outdoors? Are you playing on asphalt courts as opposed to cement courts? All have a huge impact on life expectancy of your paddle. And so there's really no answer on how long your paddle is going to last. It could last you 2 to 3 months if you're a really competitive player and you're relying on the surface texture to generate your spin. It could last you 2, 3, 4 years if you're only playing once a week and you're a recreational player. So what is your paddle constructed of? Well, the base of most paddles is some sort of a core material. And I would say probably in about 85 to 90% of the paddles out there, it's what they call a polypropylene honeycomb core, which is a plastic core structure with a cell structure to it. I don't know if you can see that, but there's huge variations in the type of core material that go into paddles, not just the thickness, but also the cell construction. There are different size cells. There's differences in the wall thickness. There's even differences in the flexibility of the core. That's going to be the majority of the problem area for your paddle. And it usually results in core deterioration, and I'll show you a couple of examples here in a second, and or delamination, which is where the paddle face separates from the core. So in an extreme example of core separation, here's one where the paddle had a huge ground strike, tore the trim off of it, and you can see that it's actually pulled the face away from the core, and it's also damaged the core. It's actually in this case, it actually split the core. So that's a huge indication that maybe you've got a problem with your paddle. So anyway, there's lots of things that can go on with delamination. So how do you know if you've got delamination going on in your paddle? It's not always as evident as something like that. The first place to start really is to look at the face of your paddle. Are there any dents or divots in the paddle? Any tears, any physical signs of damage to that paddle? It could be an indication, if there is, that you've got damage going on underneath that surface structure. Sometimes what will happen is if you have a dent that shows through on the surface of the paddle, it also can mean that that core in here is deteriorated. These walls aren't super thick, so a good tap from a paddle, like that, can damage the core structure. Now, that can come from a huge ball strike, but it can also come from tapping paddles or anything like that. So any kind of a mark or a dent on the face could be an indication you've got an underlying damage problem. One of the ways you can tell you have delamination is by sounding your paddle. First of all, your paddle's going to feel off periodically. You're going to hit a shot and it's just going to die on the paddle. Not necessarily because you've hit the outside perimeter or the dead spot, but you've hit the you've hit the ball properly, but the ball just kind of drops and doesn't go where you want it to go. And the paddle will probably sound funny. It'll probably sound like a dull thud instead of a nice sharp snap that you get from a solid laminate. One of the things that is kind of a really good indicator that you've got some serious delamination going on is that quite often when you hit your shot, you hear a buzz coming from the paddle, almost like a kazoo sound. So you can try and identify where that dead spot is or where that delaminated spot is by sounding your paddle. Now, you won't really notice it out towards the edge unless it's significant. In this case, this one has significant damage, and again, I'm pretty sure it was from a ground strike. It might not have been, but I don't know if you can hear that sort of kazooey type sound. That's what I call it. It sounds like a kazoo we used to have when we were kids, but it's not a sharp sound. And if I flip the paddle over and I sound it on the other side, I don't get that noise. So that is definitely a sign I've got some delamination going on. And that's probably the easiest way to figure out if your paddle is really in need of replacement. If you've got delamination going on, your paddle's history. There's nothing you can do to fix it, and it's time to replace it. Just another quick note on that sounding process is you're not always going to hear that delaminated area. It's not always going to be evident. Sometimes you can tap that paddle for a good 5 minutes and never recreate that buzzing sound, but as soon as you take it on the court, you hit that ball and there's that buzzing sound. If you hear that, it really is a sign of delamination and that your paddle is in need of replacement. So something else that'll affect your paddle is paddle fatigue. The materials in your paddle, like everything else, after repeated use or hard use, that paddle material is going to fatigue. It's going to start to lose its rigidity. And that goes for the core material, as well as the laminates that make up the paddle face. They're going to wear, they're going to become a little softer, and you're going to lose the pop and the controllability or the power in that paddle. It doesn't happen overnight. It usually takes time before it develops, that's the hard one to find, because you get used to playing the paddle, and because fatigue happens over time, you don't really recognize it until there's something really seriously wrong with your paddle. But it's the hard one to find, to identify. And if you have somebody that has a similar paddle to yours, maybe borrow it once in a while just to see how your paddle is in comparison. That's about the only way to spot fatigue. Or if somebody's running a demo day, maybe you can try and borrow a similar paddle and take it out and play it. So another reason to look at replacing your paddle is surface texture. If you rely 100%, or if you really rely on that surface texture to generate spin for your ball, and you're a big spinner, any deterioration in that texture is affecting your game. Whether if you're playing at a competitive level, worn texture becomes more and more important. So if you're a competitive player, you may need to replace that paddle if it's an applied texture once a month, once every couple of tournaments, to keep your paddle performing as close to 100% as possible. If you're a recreational player, maybe not so much, but it's definitely going to have an impact on how often you need to replace that paddle if you want to stay competitive. Now, you wouldn't know it by looking at me, but it's pretty cold outside, and that reminds me, one of the other things I wanted to mention is that when you go out and you play outdoors, if you're playing in the wintertime and it's cold, and I'm talking, below freezing, well, maybe even just at freezing or below, the materials in your paddle get brittle. Most of them are sort of a resin-based, which is either a plastic or an epoxy, polyester. They get brittle when they get cold, and that has a huge effect on the life expectancy of your paddle. If you're playing out in the cold, I really recommend, grab a sheet of plywood, take a jigsaw, make your own paddle, buy a $14 wooden paddle online, whatever. But don't take a good paddle outside, play it in the cold, and expect it to perform well over the long term. This material really does get brittle. And there you go. Okay, so don't play in the cold. Not with your good paddle anyway. Take a beater. Now, sometimes, I don't know, I don't really have one here. I'm just going to hold this up because I like the paddle. So sometimes what will happen is you'll hear it like a little rattle inside your paddle, and you're wondering, geez, is that important to note? Is that a problem? Maybe, maybe not. A couple things can happen during the process of manufacturing. When the paddles are cut out and shaped, sometimes the core edge here, you get little pieces of plastic that'll hang on for a while that don't get cleaned off during the manufacturing process. They break away and they end up sitting inside that core cell and they rattle. It's not the end of the world. It might be a little annoying, but it's not the end of the world. There's nothing physically wrong with your paddle. The other thing that can happen sometimes, depending on how the manufacturer lays up the paddle and what process they use, is you can get little beads of resin that build up in that cell wall if you get a little oversaturated laminate. And those beads, they'll hang on for a while, and then all of a sudden they let loose, and then they start to rattle around inside your paddle. You'll usually find that towards the center of the paddle, and it'll be a little bit heavier sound than just a light rattle. The other thing that can happen, though, is if you have core damage, especially again if you're playing out in the cold, the cell walls fracture and you get pieces of laminate or pieces of core material floating around those cells, and that can be an indication that there's actually somewhere inside this structure those cells are damaged beyond repair and it's time to replace your paddle. So unless somebody's following you around the court with a mariachi band and asking you to join the band with a maraca, a little bit of a rattle is not a big deal unless it's coming from the center of the paddle somewhere, particularly in the sweet spot, and if you've been playing out in the cold. So just to finish up and summarize here with respect to damage and finding out if it's really time to replace your paddle because you need to, not because you want to. One, physical damage. See if there's anything around the perimeters and the edge that might indicate you've got some delamination going on the bottom or underneath in the core structure. If you've got some delamination or you suspect it, try the tap test, see if you can find it. If you do, well, you know what? That paddle's garbage. And if surface texture is what you're relying on for spin, keep an eye on that. It can be a good indicator as it wears out that you're going to need to replace your paddle maybe sooner than you'd like to. And there you go. There's some great tips on our website that'll help you with paddle care and looking after your paddle to prolong the life of it and get the most out of it. I encourage you to have a look at it. There's also a page there if you don't want to watch me drone on about it. And there you go. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful, and I look forward to seeing you on the courts sometime, hopefully, with a Brickhouse paddle. Take care.